I'm not afraid of telling the truth, and I'm not going to be silenced by people, leaders, militias, whoever they might be, who want to perpetrate lies. The Islamic Revolution of Iran really changed the entire dynamics of world history. It brought religion into politics as it had not been for decades and decades and decades. We are also with the civilians, so we're living the war. And who knew that I was going to end up, living under siege in Sarajevo, under sniper fire, under shell fire, all of that kind of stuff. Many of my friends were wounded and killed. CNN at the time, when I graduated in 1983, was a startup. Ted Turner created this thing that had never been created before. A 24-hour cable news network. Actually, genocide was taking place. And when genocide takes place, under international law, there is an obligation to try to stop it. So our obligation as journalists was at the very least to tell the truth, and that meant, in some people's views, taking sides.
Joining us today is CNN's chief international correspondent and ABC Global Affairs anchor, Christiane Amanpour. Christiane is also the host of CNN's nightly interview program, Amanpour, on which she has spoken with a myriad of extraordinary leaders in politics, business, and entertainment. She has interviewed everyone from Muammar Gaddafi and Tony Blair to Bill Gates, the Dalai Lama, and Emmanuel Macron, to name a few. Christiane, welcome.
And Jennifer Lawrence.
That Jennifer Lawrence, recently, yes. Welcome to St. Paul's.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
So I'd like to start with a bit of background and just ask how you got into journalism, how you worked your way up to where you are now with your own program. Forbes named you as one of the 100 most influential women. So how did you
Well,
get
first let me just make a quick opening to say thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you all a little bit about the world that you're about to graduate into before you go to university or take a gap year or whatever. I know that you're all mostly economics and political scientists and history maybe, very relevant to what's happening right now. I would also like to say that as a mother of a soon-to-be 18-year-old boy whose best friends are in this school as well, it's very important for me to discuss with you boys and girls, men and women, the world and the changing world that you are going to be growing up into. And it's very important, this moment of gender balance that's taking place right now. Great to see some female teachers in the room. And I'm glad to see that this boys' school has some of that in it, and it's very, very important. So we can talk about that when we get to the gender equality. So listen, just to say, I was born in England. My father was Iranian. I was taken to Iran as a young child, and I grew up in Iran. I did spend some of my schooling here in the UK at boarding school, and then I went to university in the United States. I like to say that my career was born out of adversity, because when I went to university in the US, and I'm giving you the potted version, it was when there was a revolution in Iran, and that was in 1979, the Islamic Revolution of Iran really changed the entire dynamics of world history. It brought religion into politics as it had not been for decades and decades and decades. And that my country caused a radical shift in not just the region, but in the way the West dealt with the region and with Islam. And of course, that fast forward all the way through 9/11, all the way to Syria and all the other things. I wanted to be a doctor, but I actually didn't get good enough grades in my A-levels to go to medical school. So for a while, I was incredibly upset, incredibly, sort of in despair. I didn't know what to do with my life because I thought I was going to be a doctor. But out of that failure, plus the confluence of this shift in Iran and shift on the global change, I suddenly decided, actually, I don't want to be a doctor, I want to be a journalist. I want to tell these kinds of stories that are happening to me and explain them to a wider global audience. Somehow I figured that would be a clever thing to do. I had no idea. I didn't know any journalists. I didn't, growing up in Iran, I didn't really know about, the ins and outs of the news business. So I did go briefly to a journalism school in Fleet Street to try to start it. And the only reason I went there was because my sister had enrolled there and then decided it wasn't for her. And because we were so tight on money during the revolution, I was about 20 years old at this time, I said, well, I can't waste this money. I'll go and take her place. So I went and did the last term of this year of journalism study in Fleet Street, and that made me realize that this is what I want to do. So I went to university in the States, and I was a slightly older student, so I was 20 odd when I went to university, so I knew clearly what I wanted to do. And I powered my way through university with a specific goal in mind, to be a foreign correspondent. And while I was at university, I did internships at the local radio stations and at the local television stations. Then that led to a job at CNN. CNN at the time, when I graduated in 1983, was a startup. Ted Turner created this thing that had never been created before. A 24-hour cable news network. Now it seems everybody's doing it, you know. You've got the BBC World Service, of course the radio was always there, but TV, you've got Sky News, you've got Fox News, everybody's doing 24/7, not to mention online now. But when CNN did it, when Ted Turner created this in 1980, it was a startup and it was revolutionary, and it revolutionized the way people got their news, people communicated with the world and with their governments and with global affairs. So that was my good luck, to arrive at CNN as a graduate from university at a startup, which meant that I was able to work my way up to the very top because I had the wherewithal, I had the competence, very important. None of this is only luck. None of this is about being given, special chances and, leapfrogging over other people. It's really hard work, which I love. Because starting at the very bottom of the ladder and climbing my way up, and I think this is very important for you guys to understand, is it solidifies your experience, your knowledge, your team building, and your sense of confidence, self-confidence and competence. You can only really get that when you go through each rung of the ladder of advancement in the professional world. So that's what I did, and then, then I got my job as a foreign correspondent after about 3 years, and it was again when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and this was in 1990, so it was the first Gulf War. And then I spent the rest of my career covering wars, crises, natural disasters, and the last several years of my career I've had my own show, and I interview all the world leaders who I used to report about when I was in their backyard covering, their stories. So I come at my interviews, again, with a basis of knowledge and experience. And they've seen me, so they know who I am, because CNN is global. And so that's a long way of telling you how I got to this point.
And looking at your early days of reporting,
yeah,
as you were talking about, you extensively covered the Bosnian conflict,
yes,
taking place in the early to mid-90s. And it was a very important period, not just in the region, but globally. How important was this period for you in your life and also in your career?
Well, both. It was incredibly important in both. First of all, it was the first of these, what we call civil wars, but it wasn't really a civil war. It was civilians pitted against civilians. Or one side was very heavily armed and had the backing of a state with all the military and all the hardware that came with it. But it was focused on children, women, men, with the idea of ethnically cleansing them from certain parts of Bosnia. So it was my first experience, because the Gulf War was army against army. It was a big set piece, as we generally imagine wars to be. Bosnia was the first of what we see now all over the world, which is civilians being caught and being the main targets of warfare. So then, if that's the case, we are also with the civilians, so we're living the war. And who knew that I was going to end up, living under siege in Sarajevo, under sniper fire, under shell fire, all of that kind of stuff. Many of my friends were wounded and killed. It was the first war where reporters were directly targeted, not caught in the crossfire where they had been before, whether covering Lebanon or Central America or World War II, Vietnam, whatever it is. All those wars, reporters were considered helpful to the story of each side. They figured if they could get their story out with journalists, that was important, so they would keep journalists safe. Bosnia changed all of that. Because we were reporting live in their backyard and there were some really bad actors, they actually wanted us They wanted to silence us. And actually, fast forward to today, you can see all over, whether it's in the United States of America under the current administration, whether it's in Russia or Turkey or Philippines or any of those more autocratic states, they have no respect for the free press, and all they want to do is silence the free press. So that was very formative for me. Plus, I also had to make a moral decision of what was the truth and what was lies. Again, here we are in the midst of this fake news tsunami, but fake news basically means lies. And lies have been told by people who want to change and shape, their version of history since time immemorial. And they certainly did this in a big way in Bosnia. So I had to cut through those lies and find the truth. And that was often unpopular, because the truth meant that the world actually had to intervene, because the truth was that ethnic cleansing was happening, which then was enshrined under law at the International Criminal Tribunal, well, the ICTY, the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia in The Hague. Actually, genocide was taking place. And when genocide takes place, under international law, there is an obligation to try to stop it. So our obligation as journalists was at the very least to tell the truth, and that meant, in some people's views, taking sides. And that was what I got criticized for. But I don't make any apologies for it, because it was telling the truth. And that is what shaped me as a person and as a professional. I've never wavered from that. I'm not afraid of telling the truth, and I'm not going to be silenced by people, leaders, militias, whoever they might be, who want to perpetrate lies. Because, information is power these days, and I'm very conscious of that. And so you have, at the very least, you deserve to get the truth.
So during this crisis, you interviewed General Mladic.
I did.
Who, for those of you who don't know, he caused basically the genocide and deaths on a monumental scale. The war's estimated to have claimed over 100,000 lives. And in your career, you've interviewed some pretty powerful people who have been dictators, Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe, Hosni Mubarak. Often you posed very direct and on-the-spot questions. How did you consider the fact that you were asking questions that, regardless of the response that they elicited, would have perhaps unintended impacts on their population and their people?
I didn't really even think about that. I didn't think about it. The worst thing to do is to get yourself all worried about where your questions are going to land. As a journalist, my responsibility is to be as prepared as possible, as you would be if you were going to an exam or into an interview that your future depended on it. You would be as prepared as possible. You would be as engaged as possible. You would have read you would be almost more of an expert on that person as they are themselves on themselves. That's you have to do. That's the homework that we have to do as journalists if we're going to do a good job, not just skate across the surface and ask dumb questions and basically get palmed off by people who are very clever at trying to deflect and distract and put their own truth across. So I didn't think about the effect on them. I thought about the effect on my viewers, and I thought about the effect on on what was going on in the world in that particular location. So with Mladic, General Mladic was the guy who was running the Bosnian Serb war machine during the Bosnia War, and he was responsible for the massacre in Srebrenica. If any of you heard of that, it's 22 years ago that happened, nearly 23 years ago, and he's just been in the last several months convicted under genocide and crimes against humanity at the War Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia. So, you just have to ask the very, very tough questions. And sometimes, they try to intimidate you, these people, they try to stare you down, they try to threaten without actually saying it, that they're going to mess you up.
Were you nervous?
Yeah, always nervous, especially when you're in... I'm nervous first and foremost about doing a good job and getting to the truth.
But
right?
in terms of the fact
Physical,
that they were dictators.
Yes,
and
I was
tyrants.
nervous. You'd be stupid not to be, because CNN was the first to actually, as I say, broadcast live in the backyards, as it happens, of these dictators and mass murderers. So they could have plucked me at any time from their backyard and shoved me in jail or done worse too. And they have done that. I mean, just look at ISIS. Look at what happened to my colleagues in Syria. You know, what happened in Syria was a extreme version of what started in Bosnia. Bosnia, I told you, journalists started to be attacked. Well, in Syria, under ISIS, you know, they were specifically kidnapped to be executed in public. You know, so it's a very difficult thing to do this job right now. It's very, very dangerous and very, very scary. And you know, it takes very committed people behaving very carefully with the maximum amount of experience and you know, homework to go into these places now. Very difficult.
So moving on from your time in Bosnia, I know that you're a huge champion of gender equality.
I am.
And women's rights, and it's, you know, been an issue throughout history, but recently, for example, we've seen women journalists at the BBC speaking out, and as a result, a number of high-profile male journalists have taken pay cuts. Do you think that that example is indicative of a broader change, and do you think that we're reaching a turning point with gender equality, in particular the gender pay gap and equality in the workplace?
Well, look, I very much hope so. I think there's a lot of work still to be done. But, you know, gender equality in 2018, it's like a no-brainer. I mean, let's get with the picture. There is absolutely no reason anymore for this kind of massive gap and inequality, whether it's in pay, which is still, you know, dramatically different, even in the West. I believe, you know, it's 17% difference for the same job between a man and a woman here in the West. So you can imagine elsewhere around the world, it's even worse. I was sent with a team of. I was one of 3 women who were sent to the Gulf War to Saudi Arabia, which is a famously, you know, gender inequality place, right? And they'd never seen female professionals like us. And this was in 1990, so imagine. I mean, that's a long time ago. And there was a lot of local reporting and even international reporting about why did CNN send 3 women to Saudi Arabia? Don't they know that women don't, you know, get a shot there? Women, I mean, why? Why would they send women? I mean, CNN didn't think about it. We didn't think about it. We were just journalists and we went. And actually, it stood us in very good stead. We actually got a lot of scoops because the local Saudis were so surprised to see 3 women coming at them that they generally said yes before they said no. So I realized then that it's actually a great advantage. So I have never felt at a disadvantage being a woman, partly because I refuse to let anybody treat me as a second-class citizen, but partly because I saw with my own eyes that actually it is an advantage. It's not a disadvantage in every aspect. So gradually, there's been a huge number of journalists who now are women in my field, in war correspondence, and in operating cameras and all the rest of it. Before it was, you know, a few women here and there. Now it's definitely half, if not more. So that's good. I mean, that's really, really good. There's a lot of progress being made. But I would say for all of you, you know, you're in an all-boys school. You're going to graduate into a male and female world, and you know, you obviously all have mums and dads and brothers and sisters. And you know that there is absolutely no future in the continuing segregation and siloing of men and women. It just doesn't make any sense. If you take it on the macro level, those of you who study economics have probably heard from Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, or others, the UN, whatever the big statistics are, that when genders are equally represented in the workforce around the world, not just them, their families, their communities, but the whole GDP increases and rises. So I was told by Christine Lagarde that if women and men are equally represented in the US workforce, which is nominally the most advanced of the Western democracies, et cetera, it would have a 5% increase in national GDP. In India, it would be 27%. So just to show you that women playing an equal role is not just a woman's issue, it's a global issue. It's really, really important. I don't know how you all feel about this current Me Too movement, and I'm happy to take a question or two about it afterwards. But you mustn't think as boys that this is an attack on the male gender. It is absolutely not. It is absolutely a timely reckoning, a timely, I hope, game-changing moment. I really do hope that it's a tipping point moment, because it should be. Because if it's not the overt sexual abuse and sexual harassment, it is everyday sexism and misogyny that women have endured, including myself, for millennia, right? So it's time that this playing field was leveled. And it's not a war of women against men, or women suddenly wanting to be in the driver's seat. It's not that at all. It's just going from there to there. And that makes it healthier for everybody. Boys, girls, men, women, families, and you're going to find it as you go out into the workplace. You're going to have to be probably competing a lot more with women who are competent women than maybe your fathers and your grandfathers did, because there are many, many more women in the workforce right now. And I just wanted to, there is a backlash. There are a few men who are saying, oh, this is not fair, and we can't flirt anymore, and why are women getting preferential treatment, and this and that. Nothing like that. I don't accept that. I don't accept that backlash, because it's not a witch hunt, and it is actually fair. And Simon Cooper of the FT wrote, and I really do advise you to get it. I cut it out. It was this Saturday, I think. Me Too Movement and the Evolution of Man. One of his quotes that I just wanted to pull out was, obviously this started in Hollywood, right? Harvey Weinstein and all the rest of it. By the way, the company's just filed for bankruptcy, and all the women who signed non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, are being released of those NDAs as of right now. But anyway, one of the Hollywood executives said that Simon Cooper says, most younger people would probably agree with the Hollywood film executive Franklin Leonard, who said, quote, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. It's not. So that's a very, very good quote to live by. When you're accustomed to privilege, whether it's wealth, whether it's gender, whether it's class, whether it's race, whatever it might be, equality might seem like oppression, but it's not. It's actually, just leveling the playing field. So I just want you to all think about that. Understand that it's for all of our good, not just for our good.
So finally, I'd like to ask you something that you're probably asked a lot. But who has been your most interesting interview? Perhaps they've surprised you, or they weren't the same as their public persona. Yeah. Perhaps they were different in that respect.
Well, look, there have been a lot, but I would just say that I've had a couple of weird live experiences. I asked, I don't know whether the name Yasser Arafat rings any bells. He was the head of the Palestinian Authority, before that the PLO. He died a few years ago. But in one particularly tense moment when there was fights between Israelis and Palestinians, I got him on the phone for a live interview on CNN by phone. He was stuck in the West Bank. I was in Jerusalem. And he got so angry at my questions that he literally hung up on me in mid, live. And that was like, I guess if the audience could have seen me blushing, I was red as a tomato, and it was quite embarrassing. But anyway, that's one of those kind of moments. I interviewed, again, by satellite, President Clinton during the height of the Bosnia War. And it was when, all these little enclaves that were supposed to be protected by the UN were being shelled, and then that led to Srebrenica and this and that, and the death of civilians and the increase in the ethnic cleansing and genocide. So I asked him, I said, Mr. President, and I was in Sarajevo, he was in the United States, running for re-election. So I said, Mr. President, why is it that your policy is just full of constant flip-flops, and that your lack of a policy on this regard is simply empowering those who do have a policy, which were the Bosnian Serbs who wanted to cleanse Bosnia, a little bit of it, and annex it? And he was livid. And he said, there have been no constant flip-flops, madam. And this was on live television. I'm a young reporter. It's more than 20 odd years ago. And as I said, it was very cold. It was after midnight in Bosnia. And probably the screen quality was not as good as it is today. But I went deep red. And all I could do was keep looking at the lens and not to flinch, because I knew if I flinched, then the point of the question would have been, I just would have, bent over, but I wasn't gonna. So I just kept looking into the lens, and I was very stern. And then he came back later and sort of made up to me, said some nice things about me. But from then on, every world leader who I went to interview called me madam every time I went to visit them. So that was pretty funny. But you know, in the end, Clinton changed his policy. In the end, he led an intervention in Bosnia, which stopped the war, and it was very successful. So I believe that journalists did something very, very constructive there. I'm very proud of what myself and all the community of journalists who covered that war for that long, those many years, actually did something good. The first reform president of Iran was somebody who was very surprising, very interesting. His name's Mohammad Khatami. Unfortunately, the dream of reform is alive with the people, but not with the government, and people still refer to him as their reference when it comes to reform. But he's practically silenced by the regime. He's not officially under house arrest, but he's silenced. But when I interviewed him in 1998, it's the first interview he ever gave after his surprise election, he gave what has been termed afterwards as an hour-long manifesto to me that was broadcast around the world, where he talked about increased personal rights amongst Iranian men and women. He talked about a resolution between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which was fair, and no Iranian leader had talked like that about Israelis before, during the revolution. He talked about relations with the United States. He apologized for the hostage crisis. You all probably don't remember, but one of the key reasons America and Iran are at loggerheads is because right after the revolution in 1979, Iran took 52 American diplomats hostage and broke all diplomatic precedents for 444 days. And that created a massive shock in the American psyche, and to this day it hasn't really been repaired. So he apologized on camera to me for that. And so that was, all of that was surprising, and it was game-changing in its time.
Christiane, thank you very much.
You are more than welcome. Delighted to be here.
Could we please all give Christiane a warm round of applause?